Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here with you. My name is Mustafa Abedin-Nifard. Thank you, John. Yes, thank you. And I'm a faculty in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia. And it's a pleasure being here with you during this second event in the fall 2021 series of the Alireza Ahmadian lectures in Iranian and Persianate studies. Before anything, I would like to acknowledge that while we're having this event virtually, that UBC Vancouver campus is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded indigenous territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. As you are definitely aware, the topic for today is with a slight modification on the part of our speaker. It's titled the talk, Deconstructing Memories of Ali in Sunni and Shīʿī Islam. And our presenter will be Dr. Nebil Husayn and our discussant, Dr. Javad Hashmi. Before introducing them, for which I have also invited a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Navina Naqvi. I would just would like to mention a couple of quick points. The talk is being recorded, and upon the speaker and the discussant's permission, it might be publicly released in the future. If you have any questions, please save them or better, actually type them out in the Q&A box. And of course, after the discussion between the speaker and the discussant, hopefully there will be time to answer those questions. At this point, I would like to invite my dear colleague, Dr. Navina Naqvi, who's an assistant professor in Persianate Islamic cultures of South Asia and the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia, to introduce our speaker and discussant today. Thanks for joining us, Navina.
Thank you, Dr. Abedin-Nifard. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Nebil Husayn, who teaches in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Miami. His research explores authoritarianism in the Middle East, debates on the caliphate, and the development of Islamic thought. Dr. Husayn began his work as an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, where he studied Arabic, Persian, Islamic history, and Muslim cultures before pursuing study abroad in Syria and Yemen for 4 years. During his time abroad, he pursued a seminary education with traditionally trained Sunni and Shīʿī scholars. Dr. Husayn returned to the United States to obtain an MA in Arabic and Islamic Studies from Harvard University and a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. He is the recipient of a Fulbright Award and the University of Miami Fellowship in the Arts and Humanities. The family of the Prophet Muhammad, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and their descendants, known as Alids, occupy a central place in his research. Dr. Husayn's first book, Opposing the Imam, published with Cambridge University Press this year in 2021, examines the history of early Muslims who were hostile to Islam's fourth caliph, Ali, and his descendants. Dr. Husayn aims to continue interrogating the intellectual and political histories of the Alid family in his future work. Along with Dr. Nebil Husayn, we have a discussant, Dr. Javad Hashmi, who is a board-certified emergency physician, a former fellow of medical ethics at Harvard Medical School, and a PhD candidate in the study of religion, specifically Islamic studies, at Harvard University. In addition to his medical training, Dr. Hashmi holds a bachelor's and master's degree in Arabic and Islamic studies from UC Berkeley and Harvard, respectively. So without further ado, I invite Dr. Husayn to share his talk. Thank you.
Dr. Naqvi, thank you so much for that introduction. And hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for being here today and taking the time out of your busy schedules to hear me talk about theology and early Islamic history and its writing. I'd also like to thank the organizers of this event, specifically Dr. Rumi Ahmed, Mustafa Abedin-Nifard, the University of British Columbia, and the generous sponsors of the Alireza Ahmadian lectures in Iranian and Persianate studies for this opportunity to share some of the ideas I've been thinking about over the past 8 years. I'd also like to thank my discussant, Dr. Javad Hashmi, for agreeing to join us this evening to help lead us with some of his reflections on the ideas that I present as well. So without further ado, I'll share my screen. We can get started. All right, so the title for today's talk is Deconstructing Memories of Ali in Sunni and Shīʿī Islam. And the question that I have is, how did we get here? Ali ibn Abi Talib, the fourth caliph in Islamic history, the man at the center of the portrait before you, was the close kinsman of the Prophet who married Muhammad's daughter Fatima and thus became the father of all of the Prophet's grandchildren. He's revered for his wisdom, swordsmanship, and piety. He almost needs no introduction. He's revered as a saint, and for many, he's the second holiest figure after the Prophet Muhammad. He's assassinated in 660 of the Common Era after 4 turbulent years as caliph. What I'd argue is that the ghettoizing of Ali in Muslim culture and in academia is quite common. By this, I mean that his life and his political career is only ever discussed in the context of Shi'ism or intentions with Shi'ism. The same can be said about his famous son Hassan, depicted on your left, and his son Hussein, depicted on your right, the latter being famously killed in a large-scale massacre that is commemorated each year in Shi'i culture. There's this unspoken rule that these heroes of Shi'ism and the life that they led after the Prophet's death is only to be discussed in Shi'i settings or in Sunni settings that aim implicitly or explicitly to discredit Shi'i doctrines about these figures. So why write this book? The book that was published this year, as it was mentioned, Opposing Imam, aims to provide a context and a space to understand these tensions, the stories, and the evolution of understandings about these figures in non-Shi'i settings. Thus, I directed my attention primarily to Sunnism, studying Sunni hadith considered canonical and others that were not. I turned to the literature of another sect prevalent in North Africa and Oman, the Ibadis, and an early influential and rationalist theological school known as the Mu'tazila, to understand the diverse ways in which the stories of Ali and his son Hussein have been told by Muslims outside of the context of Shi'ism. The impetus to write this book came from the discovery that this venerated Sunni caliph and Shi'i Imam, and here I'm speaking of Ali, was once publicly reviled in Muslim societies. I hope to understand the processes that facilitated in the rehabilitation of his tarnished reputation in Sunni Islam. I aimed to understand the claims of Ali's antagonists and their grievances against him in particular, the relative obscurity and or extinction of sects upholding such views required the examination of Muslim literature across a number of genres. I engaged in the first detailed study of the claims and arguments of Muslims opposed to the caliphate of Ali. Lastly, I wanted to understand the ways in which the views of early antagonists to Ali endure in Islamic theology and literature until today. So, what are some key terms we'll use tonight to discuss this topic? First, there are many schools within the religion of Islam, each one consisting of revered scholars who define what is orthodoxy or correct belief in the sight of God. This evening, I'll consider the way in which Sunnism, the largest doctrinal school in the Muslim world, grappled with the diversity of stories and views on the life of Ali. Second, when I speak of canonical hadith collections, I'm speaking of those collections or sayings of the Prophet that were compiled in the Sunni tradition that came to be sources of orthodoxy and orthopraxy, or Islamic law and ritual. The most revered collection is the one that is referred to in Arabic as the authentic collection, or al-Jami' Sahih, of a scholar named Bukhari, who was active 200 to 250 years after the Prophet's death. I don't want to get into the details, but the canonical culture around this book is one where faithful Sunnis believe that in terms of historicity, this collection is unimpeachable. It's comprised only of hadith that are considered bona fide sayings of the Prophet. and other revered collections may have authentic reports in them as well, but don't share the same stature as the Bukhari's, which is reliable from cover to cover. Another example in line with Bukhari is the collection of Muslim and Naysaburi, which I will refer to as well. You could say that other respected books can be used as references, and scholars can investigate their contents for possibly authentic reports, but they don't share that same level of respect or veneration that Bukhari's work does. At the other end of the spectrum are biographical and historical texts. If you were a Sunni scholar desiring to define orthodoxy and you found a text that disagreed with your sensibilities and it came from a non-canonical source, the choice was easy. You simply dismiss the credibility of the source. Since this is an investigation of Muslim literature across these multiple genres, I compare claims about Ali made in all of these different types of sources, while acknowledging when a source is canonical versus when it is not. And again, what are the tensions that arise if something's preserved that later representatives of orthodoxy didn't like, although it was preserved, for example, in a canonical source or a non-canonical one. This is something I discuss in the final chapter of my book, and which I'll address later tonight. Lastly, I want to stake some territory for reverence for Ali in Sunni culture, or I can say reverence for Ali in non-Shi'i circles. This explains the phenomenon of hundreds of hadith praising Ali in Sunni literature and non-Shi'i theologians who painstakingly argued against other members of their own school on why Ali was a saint, a spiritual heir to the Prophet, and a judicious leader in a time when many of their peers doubted or scoffed at such doctrinal positions as views that only belonged to Shi'is. I would argue that while the earliest partisans of Ali may have had the identifier of Shia or partisan, it expanded beyond this group to include Muslims who revered him while having political and theological allegiances elsewhere. Thus, reverence for Ali or pro-Ali sentiment, or when it included his son's pro-Alid sentiment, over the 3 centuries that followed his death became a trans-sectarian movement, meaning it wasn't just part of Shi'ism, but gradually became part of Sunnism as well. Only a minority of Muslims followed a school dedicated to Ali and his family, or what became known as Shi'ism. The majority of Muslims until today understood religious and political authority as falling on all of the Prophet's disciples or companions rather than just his family. This hegemonic belief is a cornerstone of Sunni Islam. It's with that introduction that I want to briefly consider the contours of pro-Ali sentiment and to understand the stature of Ali through Muslim literature about him. I was sharing what is purportedly Ali speaking on his close relationship to the Prophet. Although everyone agrees that he was the only companion raised from infancy in the Prophet's home, or I should say caliph, because when we speak of companions, of course, there's the daughter of Fatima and the Prophet's other children. But in terms of prominent companions who became caliphs and who were the subject of debate, Ali gives this insider perspective within the Shi'i community that expands on that idea that everyone agrees on. And so he says, when I slept, I did so in his bed and beside him, so close that I could smell his fragrance. To feed me, he would first chew the food and then offer it to me. So that's him as an infant. And then he says, as a child, never did he find me speaking a lie, nor any foolishness in my actions. Here we see Ali discussing how he was the only person among the Prophet's companions to be raised in his home. He states that even as a child, he was obedient to the Prophet and followed the path of virtue. And for Shi'is, the reason why this is important, these statements reflect the infallibility of Ali. This idea that he never spoke a lie or never engaged in any foolishness is a doctrine that's upheld as orthodoxy within Shīʿī Islam. And so Ali continues, God sent a mighty angel to the Prophet in order to guide him both day and night along the path of fine morals and the perfection of character. During this time, I followed him like a young camel who follows the footprints of its mother. Every day he would stand as a banner and symbol of righteousness and morality and command me to follow him. Every year he would retreat and seclude himself in the mountains and caves of Hira. There I would see him where no one else would see him. In those days, Islam did not exist in any house except in the house of God's Prophet. He lived in this house with his wife Khadija, and after these two, I was the third. I saw the light of divine revelation and breathed in the scent of prophethood. The question of authenticity aside, there is a sense here that the intent of this monologue is to convince the listener that Ali is clearly the best person to follow and to trust after the Prophet. And I would say those who are convinced by this went from just specifically Shi'is to include other Muslims. And that's why pro-Ali sentiment was a trans-sectarian phenomenon. And it came to include Sufis, it came to include Sunnis. Ali is telling his audience that he had a uniquely intimate relationship with the Prophet. The implicit argument is that others cannot claim to be superior to him in their knowledge of the Prophet or in being closer to him. It is true that the Prophet approved of Ali in ways that were unique according to the literature that we have. One indication of this is that the Prophet declined all other marriage proposals from prominent Muslims who wanted to marry his youngest daughter, Fatima. Both he and Fatima held that only Ali would be a suitable spouse for her. And so in pro-Ali circles, it was believed that Fatima had a piety or spiritual stature, that she was the mistress of women of paradise, Sayyidat Nisa Ahl Jannah, and that she was peerless. So not only was she peerless among women, but also her spouse was also to resemble her in this peerlessness. It can be said with confidence that the Prophet viewed Ali as his apprentice and trusted companion. It's for this reason that the Prophet says about Ali, he is of my essence and I am of his. Or in another report, Ali and myself are raised from the same light. You are my brother in this world and in the hereafter. You are unto me as Aaron was unto Moses. And so far, we've considered characteristics of Ali that were affirmed in canonical sources. When we turn to non-canonical hadith, statements that medieval Sunni scholars did not affirm were authentically from the Prophet, we get into murkier waters. You could say the claims get more provocative. Let's look at an example. Historians note that the Prophet said of Ali, "You are my heir, vizier, and successor after me." This sounds pretty straightforward regarding whom the Prophet favored as his successor. But there's a part of the statement that copyists of manuscripts could not agree on. In some places, the Prophet says, "Fi amongst my ummati." The ramifications of either statement are predictably enormous, otherwise I wouldn't be bringing it up. According to one manuscript, the Prophet is simply noting that Ali would be the next chief of the family, namely the Hashmi tribe to which they both belong. In another, the statement is much wider in scope. The Prophet is appointing him as his successor in the entire community. Since we have both versions, we are left asking, is this a Shi'i affirming text, a smoking gun, right? Where the Prophet said, Ali is my successor in the community, but then it was defanged of its bite. It was amended to just say, only within my family. Or is this an innocuous text, right? Where the Prophet is just saying, he'll be my successor in my family, enhanced with a Shi'i accretion, right? Where it changes to be much wider in scope. The authors I study in my book, especially in chapters 3 and 5, which are about Al-Jahid, the Mu'tazili, and Ibn Taymiyyah, the Sunni, are adamant in supporting the second theory. So in this case, they are sure the Prophet said, "Fi ahli," amongst my kin. But later she's amended the text so it read, "Fi ummati," so that Ali was his successor in the community. It's with this assumption that Jahid and Ibn Taymiyyah went about blunting the polemical edge of any pro-Ali hadith that they found, which suggested he should be caliph. They argue either Shi'is made up these reports, embellished them, or read them out of their original context. After the Prophet's death, the question of who would succeed him fragmented his disciples into a number of factions. The allegiances grew in their complexities as the decades passed. Here, I'll try to start with simplicity and then gradually add to this knowledge base to help us frame these disagreements. First, there are those who supported authority going to the most senior members of the community who had the most clout. This faction became partisans of the first three caliphs. Not only did they revere the memory of these three and view them as pious authorities, but also they based Islamic law and knowledge of religion on the followers of these three caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman. The second faction consisted of those who believed Ali was the natural heir to the Prophet. The clan to which the Prophet and Ali belonged was that of Hashim, and its Hashemite kinsmen and their partisans who held Ali to be the most knowledgeable and distinguished of the Prophet's disciples, and revered him after his death when other Muslims did not. The third faction to consider is represented by the clan of Ali's predecessor, the Umayyids. Ali's predecessor, Uthman ibn Affan, was assassinated after a siege of his home that lasted many weeks, if not months. And the family of Uthman blamed Ali for these events, since those who had laid siege to the caliph's home had respected Ali. Although Ali may not have been involved in the assassination, the Umayyads considered anyone who had criticized Uthman culpable in this hyper-partisan atmosphere that believed, if you're not with us, you're against us, and fomented tribal feuds. Thus, when Ali became the fourth caliph, the Umayyads rebelled against him. To Ali's dismay, the partisans of the first three caliphs rebelled against him as well, and thus his caliphate was rocked with civil war after civil war. To take a bird's eye view of how it all panned out, after Ali's assassination, the Umayyads take the reins of the caliphate and turn it into a dynastic monarchy. They rule for close to a century. Then there is a wide-scale revolt that foments from Central Asia and heads west to topple them in Arabia. The leaders of this revolt pledge allegiance to the old rivals of the Umayyads, the Hashemites. And so the Hashemites then have their own monarchy for 5 centuries until another army, the Mongols, lay siege to their empire and end their rule. If we wanted to take snapshots of allegiances to different religious and political authorities 100 years after the Prophet, it would look something like this. You'd have 4 factions with one of them split in 2. You'd have those who revere the first 3 caliphs, those who revere the Umayyad dynasty, and then those who followed a Khariji school, an independent school discussed in the book, but which we won't tonight. Last, you'd have the pro-Ali faction split between those who say all authority should remain exclusive to Ali's family, and those who revered Ali and his descendants, but were broad in viewing other members of the community as authorities as well. For example, there may have been some who viewed the first 2 caliphs, Abu Bakr and Umar, as wise and pious leaders, but also respected Ali. They did not view reverence for these different caliphs as necessarily contradictory. Now, if we try to take a snapshot 200 years after the Prophet's death, these different circles would still be intact, with a caveat that there is now a new religious elite, scholars of the law and theology who've become fed up with caliphs claiming to be the successors to the Prophet. They are the drivers of a new ethic, أَنَّ الْعُلَمَاء وَرَثَةَ الْأَنْبِيَاء, that the scholars are the real heirs of the Prophet. So beforehand, it was caliphs who claimed this. So while you have scholars that identify with the above factions, there is a set of centrist scholars who keep an ethic of either we cannot judge because we don't have enough certainty on who is right and who is wrong in all of these conflicts that occurred 2 centuries before. So we'll leave it to God to discuss who to punish and who to reward in the hereafter. Or some who had an even more radical optimism. They say we might have our own theories on who is right and who is wrong, but we'll maintain belief that God will forgive everyone who was involved. Now, where would we locate Sunnism? If we wanted to locate Sunnism, it's part of this burgeoning community of centrist scholars who acknowledge that their own teachers and authorities may have been part of one of those other factions, even if centrists themselves were not. Thus, to read a Sunni Hadith collection is to read a work with contributions from those who were pro-3 Caliph, pro-Umayyad, pro-Ali, or centrist. By contrast, it's fairly easy to read Shi'i works and understand their sources. They are mostly written by partisans of the family of Ali who viewed them as the rightful imams or leaders of the community, both in terms of political power and religion. Our last snapshot is taken 300 years after the Prophet. While I don't want to diminish the existence of other factions and schools both within and outside of Sunnism and Shi'ism, in terms of the enduring culture surrounding Ali, I would describe Muslims as having one of 6 different views. The first group is made up of zealous pro-3 Caliph, pro-Umayyad, or Khariji Muslims who publicly condemn Ali and his partisans as evil. The second group doesn't condemn Ali outright, but opposes any special veneration of him. They tend to say he was a fallible person who may have committed blunders and that he may have harmed the Muslim community when he became caliph, or in fact, some may even argue or deny that he had ever become a legitimate caliph, rather that it was a time of fitna where people were fighting and no one was caliph between Uthman and Muawiyah, the first Umayyad king coming to power. The third group became the orthodox position of Sunnism. Ali is accepted as the fourth rightly guided caliph. The fourth group regarded him as the greatest Muslim after the Prophet, but didn't consider him divinely appointed to the caliphate. So they held that Ali was the wisest and most meritorious Muslim after the Prophet, but didn't go so far to say that Muhammad appointed him as his successor. The fifth group became the orthodox position of Shi'ism. Ali was the rightful heir of the Prophet, selected by God or selected by the Prophet before Muhammad's death. And the sixth group was made up of ghulat, or radical Shi'is, that viewed Ali as a manifestation of God. In late antiquity, the belief in humans either being divine or demigods was quite commonplace. It seems most cultures believed that about rulers or had myths of this type regarding holy men. It seems foreign to us now, but for the exception of Christianity, where God or the Word is made flesh in Jesus. In this circle, stories about Ali's miraculous power over the universe, his omniscience and omnipotence, were a common motif. The absolute monotheism that usually is associated with Islam made group 6 extremely marginal and condemned by both Sunni and Shīʿī orthodoxy. If the spectrum could be laid out from 1 to 6, or those who held animosity for Ali, all the way down to those who believed in his divinity, it would look something like this slide. All of this might seem a bit rudimentary, but I promise you the reason why I'm discussing this is that it seems no one else has mapped out these nuances or this spectrum that I lay out in regards to Ali. The go-to model is anachronistic and tends to imagine Sunnism and Shi'ism as 2 branches that split apart at the Prophet's death. While the argument may require some charitable readings, my argument would be this. Sunnism is so wide in its scope that its literature preserves members who seem to occupy all 6 groups. If I was asked, I could place a Sunni scholar in each group. Shi'ism, by contrast, would only occupy groups 4 through 6 on this spectrum. Again, so what is the spectrum? Group 1 held animosity for Ali. Group 2 avoided his praise and veneration. Group 3 accepted him as the rightly guided caliph. Group 4 held him to be superior to all other disciples of Muhammad. Group 5 held that God and the Prophet had anointed him as Muhammad's rightful heir. And Group 6 upheld his divinity. So if we were to zoom out 300 years after the Prophet's death, it's here that we can be certain people self-identify as Sunni or Shīʿī. We can also discuss some of the cultural currents associated with a layperson belonging to each faction. So what do we find? Shi'is can be accurately described as centering Ali and the Prophet's family at the core of their religious culture. They have separate circles of learning, books, and rituals that Sunnis do not. For pro-Ali Sunnis, by this point, they've come to revere Ali in very similar ways to Shīʿī laypersons. Ali is a hero, he's remembered as unparalleled in wisdom and in combat, and the Prophet's descendants are also revered in Sunni societies as nobility. And then when we look, we'll see that there are other Sunnis who are skeptical of all of this reverence for Ali and the authenticity of hadith that praise him. They tend to show sympathy for the Umayyids and scholars who were anti-Shīʿī. Thus, when they discuss history, it's one that aims to discredit pro-Ali arguments and texts. And then there are those Sunnis who are mostly neutral on history, either in being uninformed or consciously not wanting to wade into controversial waters. Some Sunni laypersons remained aloof. The cultural code here is that I don't want to accidentally say something about a sacred figure in the past that will offend God, who will then punish me in the hereafter. And then as a consequence, I neither discuss nor take a position on this political history. So you see how Sunnism has these different dimensions within its culture. Now, if we were to study Shīʿī literature across multiple genres, they would all converge on the following historical assumptions. Ali never made a mistake in his life. God selected the Prophet's family to serve as the heirs to his spiritual, legislative, and executive authority. The Ali Imams were omniscient and performed miracles as proof of their rank in the sight of God. Those who were not pro-Alid were disobedient to God and or evil. And so you will find reports from the disciples of the Alid Imams that claim these things. And you would find history, or what we would call hagiography, with anecdotes that affirm these points as well. Theologians would also rationalize why these statements were true and so on. And so we find all of this to be part of Shi'i sacred history. By contrast, Sunni literature affirmed what we might call alternative facts. Reading Sunni hadith, we may be convinced that the Prophet desired Abu Bakr to succeed him. Ali never challenged the authority of the first three caliphs. There was no disagreement between the Prophet's family and his companions after his death. The armies who fought Ali led these rebellions in pursuit of justice. The Battle of the Camel, which was fought between the tribe of Abu Bakr and the tribe of Ali, was started by an evil band of men in Ali's army who wished to destroy Islam. And furthermore, their leader was a shadowy, diabolical Jewish man who was everywhere and nowhere at once. He fomented the murder of Ali's predecessor and then caused civil war in Ali's reign. And not to be outdone by this anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic trope, historians noted that his mother was Black as well. So a careful study of this legendary figure known as Ibn Saba has been carried out by Professor Sean Anthony, and I can discuss this figure more in the Q&A, but for now we'll have to move on. What is my takeaway in reading these competing historiographies? Writers are engaged in a project of community building. They're producing collective identities through historical narratives that validate them. The stories within these sacred histories explain why I am X and not Y, right? Why I am A and not B. When you read a story of Ali behaving as a wise, impeccable leader, magnanimous with his opponents, compassionate with the poor, and so on, it's an explanation of why I'm a follower of Ali 200 years after the fact. When one reads a story of how the Prophet implicitly encouraged Abu Bakr to lead the community in worship in his final days, it's a compelling argument, illustrative form of why I'm a follower of Abu Bakr 200 years after the fact. These sacred histories represent theology or ideology in narrative form. The argument I'm making here, following Bruce Lincoln, is that I would not need to read a catechism or work explicitly laying out Sunni or Shi'i creed to know the orthodoxy of that school. One can see them on display in the arguments and assumptions of the stories that we read in their sacred works of hadith and their respective historiographies. The exciting aspect of early Sunni literature is that it is a trove in terms of diversity. A single Sunni work on history will have contributions from anti-Alids, pro-Alids, centrists in the middle, and so on. Officially, Sunnism endorsed the views of Group 3. Ali was ranked as the greatest companion after the first three caliphs. However, anti-Shi'i polemicists relied on those Muslims who espoused opposition to any special veneration of Ali, those who are known as Group 2. From time to time, it sympathized with the arguments made by Ali's antagonists, those who are known as Group 1. This allowed anti-Alids of the first 2 centuries to continue to have an enduring legacy long after their disappearance, and their explicitly anti-Ali doctrines had lost favor. Sunnis likewise included the contributions of early pro-Alids in their literature, and this led some of them to regard Ali as the greatest Muslim after the Prophet, so those who were Group 4, while others resembled Shi'is even more by identifying him as the rightful spiritual heir of the Prophet, those who were Group 5. Although they refrained from criticizing the first 3 caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, or their legitimacy when recognizing Ali as the spiritual heir to the Prophet. It's here we can study the efforts to shape portrayals of Ali among Sunni scholars who viewed themselves as representatives of orthodoxy. First, they sought to suppress and condemn overt anti-Ali sentiment in the Sunni literature that was transmitted. It became heresy to curse Ali or accuse him of sinfulness. So searching for these texts at times feels like looking for needles in a haystack. While I want to take all the credit for finding these exceptional cases by browsing and reading every single volume from cover to cover, my work is profoundly aided in the digital world, where I can use string searches to go through databases that have digitized thousands of medieval Islamic texts. So my work has been made easy with technology. Second, scholars aim to discredit any whiff of Shi'ism. This included texts portraying Ali as superior to his predecessors or noting any disagreements he had with them. Third, scholars circulated reports in which Ali appeared to be a fallible person. They may have done this unintentionally for two reasons. First, this organically happened whenever they drew on the legacy or contributions of pro-3 caliph and Umayyad predecessors, as my research demonstrates. And second, it was infidelity to their belief in the canonical culture of hadith or the historicity of such reports that led scholars to say, well, in this case, I guess Ali must have upset the Prophet. 2 centuries after the fall of the Umayyids, Ali was now a respected figure in Sunni culture. In this new context, scholars now always assumed that Ali would be forgiven, and the error at stake was not so egregious as to lead him to be condemned by God. It's here we see how the reception of literature antagonistic to Ali in its origins can end up in circles that will charitably read it as not to condemn him, as the original authors certainly intended. In the final chapter of my book, I go deep into the weeds and I consider the techniques and tools Sunni Hadith scholars used to forge an image of Ali that suited orthodoxy. I share with you 6 of those tools tonight. First, flat-out identification and rejection of the authenticity of anti-Ali reports. The easiest way one did this was through an ad hominem attack or criticism of the transmitters of that report. What qualified as anti-Ali depended on the eye of the beholder. As we'll see in a later slide, sometimes anti-Ali hadith was transmitted from one generation to the next. In this example, Ibrahim ibn Yaqub al-Juzajani narrated that he heard an Umayyad prince explain that the Prophet described Ali as the Qarun rather than the Harun of the community. While Juzajani was a respected scholar in the proto-Sunni hadith community, he narrates hadith, for example, that appear in Bukhari's Sahih, this report was roundly rejected as it was clearly a counter-report to the famous one that was accepted by hadith scholars, where the Prophet describes Ali as the community's Aaron. In some cases, the hadith or historical report in question could not be fully rejected because it referred to an incident that most people believed were true. Here we have to deal with a history where even when this incident did happen, we see how Ali's antagonists would ascribe blame to him, and as generations passed, the ways in which Sunnis attempted to move away from such claims. The details were amended so that culpability in a crime would be deflected away from Ali to someone else. I'd like us to consider 2 examples tonight. First, in the Prophet's lifetime, there's an incident where a wife of his, commonly portrayed as Aisha, is falsely accused of infidelity. This distresses the Prophet, the wife in question, and causes a public scandal. According to Umayyad princes who narrated the tale, Ali was the culprit in spreading that slander. Although Sunni canonical reports acknowledge that Umayyids claimed this, the narratives deflect blame away from Ali to other unnamed hypocrites in the community and sometimes Medinese personalities. A second example is the assassination of the 3rd caliph and Umayyad chief, Uthman ibn Affan. There are many reasons why the Umayyids considered Ali culpable in his murder. Ali had served as a negotiator between the protesters and Uthman during the siege on his palace. Ali had also criticized Uthman and parted ways with him before he died. Those Muslims who criticized Uthman had viewed Ali with admiration for many years. Ali had been viewed as Uthman's rival because Ali had almost become the 3rd caliph after Uthman's death. And lastly, the Umayyids and Hashmids appear to have been rival clans who jockeyed for influence and power in Mecca for a few generations. The Umayyids were deeply angered with Uthman's murder and took a scorched earth philosophy that anyone who had criticized him was responsible for his death, since the protest precipitated and culminated in his assassination. And so Ali became the prime target of such blame. How would Sunnis deal with this charge given that Ali fought not 1, but 2 armies that were raised to avenge the death of Uthman? Historians argued, well, since Ali was a righteous companion, he should not be suspected in participating in the murder. Rather, the blame for Uthman's murder was deflected to some of Ali's close disciples and some unnamed individuals. In one case, it seems that Muslims recast an epithet that Umayyids used to disparage Ali into a beloved nickname. Umayyad caliphs and governors consistently referred to him as Abu Turab, father of dust, rather than his tenanym, father of Hassan, Abu Hassan. I dig up examples in which Umayyads use the phrase and Ali's close disciples and Iraqi partisans are confused on whom the Umayyads are referring to when they use that phrase Abu Turab. They have to ask the Umayyads, do you mean Ali, the father of Hassan? I wish there was more clarity on why the Umayyads chose this particular name, and I provide a few theories. First, they may have been making fun of his appearance, arguing that he may have looked like a shabby nomad compared to the opulence that Umayyads enjoyed in their palaces in Damascus. Second, they may have created a well-known backstory in which the Prophet gives him this name when he finds Ali sleeping on the ground in the mosque after having an argument with his wife. In any case, it's clear the Umayyads referred to Ali this way to diminish his standing. However, after the Umayyads, Sunni and Shīʿī scholars both claim that it was an honorable nickname that the Prophet gave Ali and that Ali himself loved it. But I theorize this is a recasting of an Umayyad contribution. I argue that copyists and compilers of hadith collections were occasionally compelled to delete components of a report that was offensive to their sensibilities. Hadith explicitly denigrating Ali in particular could not continue to circulate intact after the Umayyad period, as most Muslims gradually came to accept them as the fourth caliph. For example, both Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi and Ibn Abi al-Hadid transmitted a hadith on the authority of al-Bukhari that stated, quote, the family of Abu Talib are no allies of mine. By the Mamluk period, extant copies of al-Bukhari's Sahih no longer identified the family of Abu Talib as the clan in question. In his assessment of the report, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani concurred that Abu Talib's family was indeed originally named in the report, although copies of the Sahih no longer did so. Ibn Hajar was sure of this because he found a variant of the report in Abu Na'im al-Isfahani's Mustakhraj of al-Bukhari's text that hadn't deleted the family's name. Ibn Hajar and Badr ad-Din al-Aini noted in their commentaries that some copyists mistook the note about the deletion or blank space bayal in the manuscript for the name of a tribe. Thus, these copyists understood the Prophet to have declared the family of Abu Bayad or the family of Abu blank space are no allies of mine. It seems al-Bukhari's hadith essentially appeared in 4 different forms in its transmission. Excuse me 1 second. There is the uncensored version, the family of Abu Talib, Ali's father, are no allies of mine. The obfuscated version, the family of Abu so-and-so, or in Arabic, Fulan, are no allies of mine. The erased version, the family of Abu are no allies of mine, and there you'd have that blank space. And finally, the mistakenly corrected edition that says, the family of Abu Bayad are no allies of mine. Copyists and scholars amended hadith that they considered objectionable in at least 3 ways. First, there was the obfuscation of a companion's identity if a hadith seemed to depict the person in a negative light. In the previous slide, you saw the example of how the clan of Abu Talib became Abu Fulan, or so-and-so. Here you have another example. The second caliph curses the companion Samura ibn Jundab for selling intoxicants during his caliphate. In the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal and other sources, Samura's identity is provided. Despite using the exact same chain of transmitters, when Bukhari narrates the report, the identity of the companion is obfuscated and replaced with Fulan, so-and-so. I had a colleague once tell me medieval Muslim copyists censored themselves so much that someone could write an excellent article on the story of this Fulan fellow in Islamic literature. He appears everywhere. You have so much material that you can use. And the point is well taken. One could write a guide on when and why Muslims appear to obfuscate the name of a person, and further follow up the references to see if they can identify the person when possible. Alternatively, some chose to obfuscate the portion of the text that denigrated a companion. Ali's offensive views about the first two caliphs were reduced to him claiming this and that, kada wa kada, when we read the version that appears in the collection of Bukhari. But when we turn to the collection of Muslim, which is a work revered like Bukhari's in its reliability, we see that Ali and other Hashemites are portrayed as having very negative views about a particular legal decision made by Abu Bakr and then upheld by Umar. Sunni Hadith collections included the contributions of Ali's partisans and detractors in the construction of an image of Ali that was neither evil nor fully impeccable. Ali appeared as a normal human, subject to the same challenges and temptations as everyone else. The content of the reports below suggests that when Ali's detractors encountered a hadith about his merits, they would narrate a counter report to contradict it. As we saw previously, a famous hadith that described Ali as the Harun, or the Aaron of the community, was reshaped so he became Qarun of the community. In other cases, the examples are slightly more subtle. Ali's partisans portrayed him as a saint who worshiped God abundantly and greatly resembled the Prophet or Christ in his habits of worship. On the other hand, Ali was portrayed as leading prayer services intoxicated in the lifetime of the Prophet, in a state of major ritual impurity when he became caliph. Al-Bukhari also narrated a report in which Ali annoyed the Prophet by declining his invitation to join him in prayer. These reports appear to contradict the image of Ali as a devout worshiper and support the pro-Umayyad image of Ali as a man who did not pray or worship God 5 times a day. Merits that were ascribed to Ali in some cases were ascribed to the first 3 caliphs in Uthmani or pro-3 caliph circles as well. Thus, in the hadith collections of Bukhari and Muslim, the permission given to Ali and Fatima to keep the entrance to the Prophet's mosque open was given to Abu Bakr instead. What are we learning from all of these examples? We learn how a single canonical work, a text understood to be unimpeachable in its historicity among the faithful, preserves evolving and contradictory images of a sacred figure. In some cases, a claim was so offensive, not only was it suppressed, but memory that such a claim once circulated was erased and denied. As a consequence, we see that Umayyad hadith and doctrines are mostly excluded from hadith collections. But at the same time, when we read the work of Sunni polemicists, there is a second move to deny that the Umayyids or early companions ever really hated Ali. Rather, they all respected one another in the ways that Sunni Muslims respect companions today. Thus, anti-Ali sentiment has come to possess an erased history, borrowing from Dr. Wendy Brown. It's not that it no longer exists, there's a denial that it ever existed. I've seen polemicists now argue that the Umayyids never cursed Ali from the pulpits, which is insane given that there's evidence they did this for multiple decades in multiple cities. We learn about the editorial enterprise at work in the maintenance of orthodoxy. We understand the tools that scholars use to shape images of Ali that agreed with their sensibilities. And so I'd like us to close by considering how partisanship and polarization of society outlasted the lifetimes of 7th century rulers of Arabia. Muslim literature, both canonical and non-canonical, preserves the sentiments of these various factions. A study of the formation of Sunni orthodoxy regarding Ali is a study of all of these sentiments. Lastly, I would argue that polarization in the United States or in American politics today is reminiscent of some of that 7th century Hashemite and Umayyad rivalry for the throne and the historiography that ensued. For example, President Obama is viewed as a good person and righteous leader by many, but he's reviled as evil and illegitimate by a rival tribe. 200 years from now, there will be partisans of Obama and many historians who will praise him, but also a threat of antagonists relying on Fox News reporting, or right-wing authors, or foreign journalists who will claim that Obama was not the praiseworthy person that people remember. The same goes for Donald Trump, who's a polarizing figure with avid followers. As we speak, we are creating competing historiographies and leaving them for posterity. As the decades pass, let us not be surprised with the spectrum that unfolds regarding these leaders as it did in Islamic history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Husayn, for your insightful talk. So very quickly, before we go on to your conversation with Dr. Hashmi, I just wanted to apologize to my colleague, dear colleague, Dr. Rumi Ahmed. He's the co-organizer of this event, and yet he's extremely humble. So I really forgot to even mention him. He is Professor of Islamic Law and Canada Research Chair in Theology and Ethics, and our colleague in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia. Thanks for joining us, Rumi. And again, my apologies. Would you like to say a couple of words? Okay, you're good. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. And I also wanted to, before I forget, give a big thanks to our behind the scenes team of Connie and today Nusha Yousefi, who is doing the closed captioning for us, and also Farzan Kermani for the wonderful poster designs for the whole series. And with that, let me, and I also apologize for the technical issues, but I also offer my thanks to all of the audiences for their patience. Dr. Hashmi, Dr. Husayn, we're all ears.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Husayn, for that fascinating talk, as well as the even more fascinating book that you have. I do want to share it with the audience. You can see this beautiful cover. If you can, you should purchase this book. It's a little on the pricey side. That's my only criticism about the book. I hope a paperback will be coming out soon, and maybe you have some discount codes that you can throw out if you have them. But yeah, I wanted to just give a couple minutes response, and then just I have some back and forth with you. It's interesting, as a Muslim academic, I get asked all the time by Muslims, are you Sunni or Shia? I grew up in a Sunni background. I still consider myself within this kind of larger fold of Sunnism. But when I reply Sunni now, they do either laugh or they criticize, and I honestly don't blame them. As an academic, I think I've read so widely that it's hard to hold on to orthodoxies in a strict way. And a lot of what we read problematizes kind of these strictly held narratives. Your book is definitely one that challenges some of those narratives. And I did find it to be very convincing. One of the things that I wanted to ask right off the bat that you could talk a little bit about, which you didn't talk about in this talk for obvious reasons, and also it's, as I understand it, this book is pretty much half of your dissertation, and the other half will come out later. But I don't want to forget that other half, and maybe it'll be a plug for your next work, which I do think is tied to this one, which is you talk about tafdili Sunnism in that part of your dissertation, which I find fascinating. What's interesting, so tafdili, the tafdili position, basically, as I understand it, is not necessarily someone who is Shia, probably Sunni, but thinks that Ali was probably the best candidate after the Prophet, the best candidate as successor after the Prophet, and may still view the first 2 to 3 caliphs as legitimate from a legal perspective. It seems to be this would be group 4 in the 6 groups that you list. I have found myself leaning towards this group 4, to be very honest with you. And what's interesting is that I know a non-Muslim academic who also takes this tafdili position, just based on, and that's where I wanted to talk a little bit about the historical sources. You mentioned this in your talk, that there's this difference between canonical and non-canonical sources within Sunnism. But I think as academics and historians, we obviously have to be cautious. Just because something is canonical does not mean that it's, in our minds, authentic from a historical critical perspective. In fact, from what you've said, I think there are times in which, or perhaps the presumption should be, that the canonical source is after all of these processes of orthodoxy have already taken place. You mentioned some of them, such as rejection, deflection, recasting, erasure, these forms of basically massaging these reports so that they fit with an Orthodox narrative. On this point, I just wanted to say one quick thing, which is I think sometimes a different chronology of events I want to propose a different chronology. I think that according to the Sunni paradigm, there is this idea of accepting as many hadiths as possible at some point, that there was this attempt to accept as much as possible. And so the first step may not have been rejection. Perhaps the first step is, can we explain away this report? And if we can explain away this report, then we'd actually try to keep this report. And only if those other processes are not possible, then we would reject. So it might be that we could reverse this process. That's one thing that I wanted to just put out there. But other than that, I really thought that was fascinating. Your Abu Turab example, I mean, that just, wow, I highlighted. I couldn't believe when I read that. That's such a great example. So that's basically what I wanted to start off with. If you didn't mind talking a little bit about Tafdili Sunnism, or is it just limited to Sunnism, or is Tafdili something more broad? You're on mute right now.
Can you hear me now? Thank you. Yeah, so it's tricky talking about Sunnism and Shi'ism as two different sects that are existing at the same time and splitting from the time of the Prophet. And so when we ask who believed in Tafdeel, I would say it's before the identities of Sunnism and Shi'ism came to existence. So, Sunnism relies on the culture of the Salaf. It will say, oh, the Salaf are very important. Those who saw the Prophet with their own two eyes, their followers and followers. And so Sunni Hadith biographers or the scholars of Ilm al-Rijal will say that the Salaf, meaning companions, tabi'un, tabi'un, there were individuals who were known to have held that Ali was afdal or khair, better than min al-kull, from everyone, And so this idea of tafdeel Ali, the superiority of Ali to others, was something that some early Muslims supported. And so a minority of non-Shi'is, so it's not just Sunnis, but Mu'tazilis, those who didn't follow a Shi'i legal school or theological school, meaning they weren't Zaydi, they weren't Ismaili, they weren't 12 or Shi'i, upheld this position. There is some nuance though, because one could ask what makes them different from the Shi'i proposition that Ali should have succeeded the Prophet as caliph. There were, for example, later Sufis who upheld this, let's say 600 years after the Prophet. But they would argue, and there were early Mu'tazilis who held this as well, but they would argue that that Abu Bakr, when he became caliph, was aslah. It best suited that time and place due to certain circumstances, even if Ali was afdal, had more merit or was more noble in all of these different ways. And so you have this branching of arguments, and the person who really helped me in understanding this is Dr. Hassan Ansari, who argues this point in some of his work, that the Shi'i position was to say that Ali was afdal, the most meritorious, and that he was aslah, that he was most suited to succeed the Prophet, while the non-Shi'i position for those who held group 4 was that he was afdal, but those three caliphs that preceded him, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, were aslah for one reason or another, that they were best suited at that time and place. Maybe there are certain characteristics of why people disliked Ali. Maybe they thought he was too young or whatever, or he didn't have major support. And so that's why those other caliphs were best suited at that time and place.
Interesting. Thanks for that clarification. So I thought the difference was between Tafdili Sunni and the Shi'i position, that they wouldn't believe that he was divinely appointed, that this would be the differentiation. And also, can you clarify, is the term Tafdili, is that just used for anyone who prioritizes Ali over the previous caliphs? So Shi'is by default are Tafdili, or is this a term that's used in a very specific way for this non-Shi'i position? Just clarity on some.
Yeah, in terms of terminology, I've actually not come across that phrase tafdili in Arabic. That's more of an English appropriation of the Arabic language as like a short, like a shortcut moniker for those who upheld tafdil Ali. So the phrase tafdil Ali occurs in Arabic, and you can find literature that talks about those who supported it or believed Ali was afdal, but they wouldn't use that phrase.
Okay, that's interesting. Because you do mention in your book, I believe you also mentioned that one of the early Abbasid caliphs, I believe it was Caliph al-Ma'mun, was leaning in this direction, and some
he had two public proclamations in 200 years after the Prophet, and you could say, I would argue that this is what made this question front and center for the greater Muslim society. If the caliph at the center of the community in Baghdad has a public proclamation saying that this is orthodoxy, that Ali was the best companion after the Prophet, it became something that people had to debate in public. It was something that scholars debated in public. And so it pitted those who were Ahl al-Hadith, those who followed Hadith, and mostly leaned towards pro-three caliph perspectives to come into debate with those who did not. And these were mostly Mu'tazilis and other theologians and Shi'is who upheld that other position.
Great. The other next point I wanted to jump to, just a quick comment on that, is that in your book, you actually list some modern day, contemporary Muslim Sunnis who are in that tafdili camp. So that I found fascinating. My follow-up to this, moving from tafdili issue, is you mentioned how after the first 100 years, of Islam, I think you wrote that there were 5 factions at that time, and I noticed that none of the positions was a pro-4 caliph position at that time. So I think that's something to highlight, that at this time it's pro-3 caliphs, and almost that's as a counter to Ali, without specifically denigrating Ali, but it is kind of denigrating Ali by saying that the first 3, right? And you notice this in certain hadith reports where they go out of their way to mention Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, but they don't mention Ali, which is clearly a dig. And silence, yes, exactly. So I think that's fascinating. So your claim then in this book is that it's only after another 100 years that now this 3 caliph position is increased. First of all, it's only one amongst many, and second, this is when Ali is kind of normalized into that 3 caliph position. Now it's a 4 caliph position. On I guess we should highlight what's at stake for Sunni orthodoxy. My understanding, and I wanted to see if you think this is correct, is that there is a necessity to upheld the rectification of the Sahaba, ta'adil as-Sahaba, to buttress the Hadith corpus. That they're the first layer of the Hadith corpus, and if we don't give them blanket kind of immunity, then we'll have a problem. Is that why you think that later Orthodoxy had to kind of wipe away or explain away these anti-Alid reports and incorporate Ali into the fold?
All right, so 2 great questions. Why we don't have 4 caliphs in the beginning, and then what's at stake in terms of Ali's rehabilitation. So I'd argue that, one of the conclusions, and other scholars have found this as well, is that the 4 caliph Khulafa Rashidin position is not an early position. It's something that developed in the 2nd century and then became common by the end of the 2nd century, you could say. And so Ma'mun is helping foment discussion about this, because in Ma'mun's lifetime, so the caliph is around 200, and also the lifetime of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, there are prominent hadith scholars that say there are only 3 rightly guided caliphs. And so it's like Ma'mun is this counterweight. Ahmad ibn Hanbal is this counterweight that's saying, no, Ahmed ibn Hanbal is saying there are 4 rightly guided caliphs, while Ma'mun is saying not only is Ali legitimate, he was the best of them. So this debate occurs after 200 after Hijri, and that's why it becomes normative at that time. And so the question is, what's at stake in this rehabilitation? I'd argue what allowed the 4 caliph theory to take hold was that you had centrist scholars saying that all of this factionalism, all of this partisanship is wrong. And all of these companions need to be rehabilitated. So it's not just Ali who benefits in a rehabilitation where he goes from villain to saint. Uthman is also rehabilitated, right? So there were times when pro-Alids, in Iraq, they didn't identify as Shi'i, but they were very critical of Uthman, or they had a question mark about him. And then so it became part of this centrist culture to rehabilitate Uthman as well. There were pro-Alids who were anti-Muawiyah, even famous Sunni scholars like An-Nasa'i, who writes who's venerated as a leading scholar of hadith. He's an anti-Muawiyah scholar. He's anti-Umayyad or anti-Amr ibn As and so on. So you had all of these different views of what the companions represented. And so Sunni culture pushed for the rehabilitation of Muawiyah, the rehabilitation of Amr ibn As, the rehabilitation of all these figures to end this factionalism, which I showed you existed in the first 100 years, 200 years, and time to bring them together. And so that's why when you read something like Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, which has 30,000 hadith, or the Mu'jam of Tabarani, which has, again, like 50,000 hadith, you have all of these factions that are brought together. You can find pro-Alids, you can find pro-Umayyids, pro-3 caliphs, and it's actually exciting that you could say Sunni literature preserves all of these strands.
That's interesting. The only issue that I have with that is that it doesn't necessarily decrease factionalism in the sense that now you're anathematizing people who fall outside of this centrist position. Right. I mean, you could easily have just said, look, the Sahaba, they had their disagreement. I mean, there's an active intent to obscure, obfuscate, and hide the factionalism that existed at the time of the Sahaba itself. So it seemed much easier to have just said, look, all this happened, but it's not relevant to our faith. We can all accept different positions. That's why I wonder if it's the issue of the ta'dil as-Sahaba that is at stake. But that's just my theory. I won't fixate on that. So I guess my other thing is, what's very interesting, and one of the questioners has asked this is, and it's your book is very interesting from that standpoint, is I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but I was just surprised at all the cursing that goes on, like mutual cursing that went on between Sahaba. And I knew that it was definitely aimed against Ali. I guess what shocked me that it was also in the other direction as well. But I guess this might have been like ritualistic in
right.
intent. And so that was interesting.
Well, one thing that my work does, it engages in a type of excavation where we see that it's believed Ali and his army would supplicate to God in doing dua against their military opponents. And those military opponents were also considered companions, right? And it's because he engaged in this type of supplication that you had Hanafi jurists that said it was okay to do that, or you had or Kufan or Iraqi jurists that said that was okay. So Zaydis and Imamis did that as well. So you see how there's a precedent because there is a memory of companions doing these things. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So I don't know how much more time we have. I just wanted to close on 2 points, basically. I guess the first is your book mentions Ibn Taymiyyah near the end of it, which I thought is a nice way to bring it towards contemporary relevance, because it sometimes feels like Ibn Taymiyyah is alive today. Ibn Taymiyyah's prominence, of course, has risen due to the Salafi trend. I myself, back in my early 20s, can say that I was a Salafi Puritan at that time. And I can see how some of the views of Ibn Taymiyyah are being refracted in this kind of anti-Shia polemic that we see today. I just think it's interesting. So you do mention on page 115 how Ibn Taymiyyah attacked wine shops, he broke containers, he censured shop owners, he destroyed sacred relics. it seems, I mean, it's, whenever you do these kind of comparisons, you run the risk of being oversimplification. And but it is tempting to see that kind of mirrored in some of the behavior of Sunni extremists today. This kind of it's description of like a Taliban kind of mentality.
Right.
But of course, Taliban are Deobandi Hanafi. But the point is that you see this kind of in this modern day, especially with this anti-Shia rhetoric. So I was wondering if you could just briefly talk about Ibn Taymiyyah's position a little bit, and what relevance do you see this in the present? And then I'll close with my next question would be, what is the major intervention, if you could just reiterate, what's the major intervention that your book is doing and your scholarship in general, because now you're going to write a second book, inshallah, right? And what is the major intervention? What's like motivating Nebil Husayn to make these interventions?
Great questions. So Ibn Taymiyyah receives the most extended evaluation in my book. I write the longest chapter is dedicated to him. One, because he wrote the most voluminous, like anti-Shi'i text written in Islamic history, his Minhaj as-Sunnah, in that he took Shi'ism very, very seriously. And I explained why he did that. What were the tensions at stake when you had rulers at that time converting to Shi'ism, and then at the same time, because Ibn Taymiyyah lived in Mamluk lands, what sort of military threat that represented for there to be Mongols or Ilkhanids who supported Shi'ism, and then also to be at war with the Mamluk Empire, and why there was an incentive for him to dehumanize Shi'is as like the worst sect of all time. And you hear that language today, like the most lying sect of all time, da, 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 da. Those who use that type of language today are relying on this very explicitly anti-Shi'i polemical text. And I know you don't want to draw, a clear historical line between those who break musical instruments, wine shops, attack people's, freedom to just live however they want, to Ibn Taymiyyah. But Michael Cook writes a book, Commanding the Good, Forbidding Evil, and you see, or Commanding the Right and Forbidding the Wrong, and you see how there is this line within Hanbali culture, going back to the medieval period, where there would be gangs who would come together and engage in this type of bravado, where they felt that it was okay to break other people's property or to break tombstones and things that they viewed as shirk, as polytheism. And so that Hanbali ethic, you could say, also inspires Wahhabism, or what was a Salafi revival of Ibn Taymiyyah. So there is certainly a connection, because even modern day folk rely on that memory of Ibn Taymiyyah as precedent that this is the right thing to do. With that being said, what does he represent? Ibn Taymiyyah took Shi'ism seriously. He writes this long refutation rather than relying on hearsay, which I think is a major problem when you read Sunni polemicists talk about Shi'ism. Usually it's a book that is incredibly, not Ibn Taymiyyah's work. I'm saying when we read what we find on the internet or what preachers might say when talking about Sunni Shi'i dialogue, that it will many times be Sunni perceptions of Shi'ism rather than Shi'ism for itself, like under reading a Shi'i text, reading what Shi'i scholars say, and so on. So the very least, Ibn Taymiyyah read a work by a Shi'i scholar, a famous Shi'i scholar, and writes this point-by-point refutation. At times, Ibn Taymiyyah is off. He might be inaccurate in some points, but at the very least, he's writing a refutation of a Shi'i work. He's allowing a Shi'i to speak for himself sometimes. And other times, Ibn Taymiyyah brings his own perception of what Shi'ism represents in some of his claims. And because that work, Minhaj as-Sunnah, is still cited today by many, many polemicists, it was worth taking a look at what is it that Ibn Taymiyyah has to say about early Islamic history, about Ali, about these questions related to Ali's politics. And I hope Ibn Taymiyyah enthusiasts read that chapter and consider what he has to say. As for that second book, and
do you mind if I just piggyback off that before then you close with where you see? So I just wanted to, on the Ibn Taymiyyah point, I as someone who, I told you I came from in my early 20s, this kind of Salafi Wahhabi background. I saw the exact same process, which is interesting. The process that you describe of dealing with these hadith, it's a similar process that polemicists deal with today. Basically, you get the report. First thing you do is either if it's too blatantly leaning in this kind of pro-Alid or Shia direction, you can reject the hadith, and so there's this kind of vigorous isnad analysis. If that doesn't work, then you deflect, you explain away, you recast. So it's interesting that even though this process went, in the classical medieval period, you see this going on, but it still wasn't sufficient to deal with this problem, because now polemicists still have these reports that they have to. So obviously this process kind of wasn't completely successful, because they still have this corpus to deal with, which is interesting. Your book, I think, is interesting because it shows when they actually had more tools that they could use, which includes amending the reports themselves. And it's very hard to argue with, from a historical basis, how these texts are being shifted. Instead of naming and shaming, it's now this person said this or that, or so-and-so said, when we know from earlier reports that seem to be earlier what's actually being said. So I think that sheds light on that early aspect, which can also give us insights into what's going on in the present when we talk about polemics. But anyways, I think this book is wonderful for everyone to read, whether you're Sunni, Shia, Muslim, or otherwise. I think it's going to be a classic. So I'm going to let you close with, and then of course the moderators will take over. But from my side, thank you. And if you want to just say something about your trajectory going forward and how you see what the contribution of this book is and your next coming in your research. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hashmi. So, when you speak of the tools that scholars have used in the past and how you see elements of that happening today, the argument that I make is that is the phenomenon of religion. We are always engaged in interpreting the tradition that we have inherited, right? Whether you are someone who's conservative or whether you're someone who's progressive, you're engaged in that grappling with the tradition and the text and reframing and massaging the text and so on. And so we can see how people do that on the far right. We can see how people do it on the far left and everywhere in the middle. Part of what made scholars famous or popular was the unique way in which they would frame a text. And I've seen, scholars do that now, or preachers do that now. A text that seems very offensive, they'll massage it in a way to try to please their audience, to say, oh, it's not so harsh, it's not so bad. And, they're always engaging in, and in terms of amending a text, believe it or not, when you study with traditional hadith scholars, I've seen it before. They will say, Allahu Alam, God knows, but I found this one evidence that says the hadith should be amended this way, and so on. And so that process is still happening, even though with the book culture that we have, or the print culture that we have, doesn't really show us that. When you read commentaries, they were engaged in that in different ways as well, and they still are. As for the trajectory, the next book, with time, with a couple years, is tentatively titled Almost Shia, Zeal for Ali and Sunni Islam. And the purpose of that book, as you mentioned, is to look at love of Ali and zeal for Ali outside of Shiism and what that represented for Mu'tazilis, for Sunnis, and so on, and how they held all of these positions that are today associated with Shiism, because we have this binary that we use to understand who is Sunni and who is not, who is Shia and who is not. And I think my work, number one, is fascinated by Ali and his family, so I'm always interested in their history, the role that they played in politics, in theology. I enjoy reading books that they wrote, or hadith, maybe hadith notebooks that they transmitted. And so that's within the Zaydi tradition, the Twelver Shi'i tradition, and there's a little bit within Sunni tradition, but it's mostly non-Sunni. And then, so in addition to looking at what were their views on tafsir, what were their views on hadith, what were their views on law, how did they live their lives after the death of the Prophet? So in addition to studying Ali and his family, or the Alids, what I hope to show in my work is the diversity that existed in our culture and in our religion. I think many of us as professors will say, Islam is not a monolith, right? Like that's just it's axiomatic. We'll say that, and my work tries to show that about Sunnism. My work tries to show that about Islamic history and how we understand these things. And hopefully, maybe one practical outcome of it is the sectarianism that exists right now, the unsheathed swords that exist right now. Maybe people can sheathe them and say, you know what? We actually have shared these views in the past, and these are one of many opinions one can have about the past, and we can tolerate one another. And this isn't specifically a Shi'i lie or something like that, where there is this tendency to dehumanize those who belong to another camp, or those who follow another religion. And hopefully when we show that those boundaries are artificial, I can lead people to stop doing that. And that they formed over time. If you can show that that development happened over time, and that in the past people had, all of these various views, hopefully that'll lead people to be more tolerant.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Drs. Husayn and Hashmi. I can see how the dialogue, this conversation could have gone on much longer, given the enthusiasm I see in both of you. And also, while I haven't read the whole book yet, but while I was reading your script and also listening to your speech, Dr. Husayn, I couldn't help actually thinking of how significant the ramifications, the positive ramifications of this research could be for, again, closing that gap in terms of like the sects and the sectarianism that you just mentioned. So I love what you're doing, and I look forward to actually reading your book, and of course, recommending it to many others as well. With that said, I just, so Connie, if you feel free to, I know that you have an appointment, so thank you so much for being with us. I'll take care of the rest. And feel free to leave now. And thank you very much to the audiences for their patience as well. At this point, I really have, I'm not sure whether we can, so do you still have some time, Dr. Husayn? There are some questions on the part of the audience. I'm not sure if we can cover all of them, but again, we want to do justice to this. So I know that you have shown willingness to receive questions via email as well. But if you're okay, I can share at least a couple of them with you.
Sure, I guess I can read through the Q&A chat.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And see which ones I can answer.
Yeah, you might want to choose like one or two at this point, and then again, I have copied all questions, and I could also invite those who pose these questions to also get in touch. In the meantime, let me also share. I hope you can see what I'm sharing right now. And this is for the purpose of both showing the audience Dr. Husayn's email address and also Dr. Hashmi's Twitter handle or ID, as they call it. So they are willing to actually, if you like, to be contacted. So yes, Dr. Husayn, and then later on I can close with just a brief news about our upcoming lecture.
Okay, all right. So I'm looking through the questions right now. The first one asks, why do Sunnis hide many hadith that say that Ali was not present at the time of first Saqifa, and why Sunnis don't admit that monarch cursed Ali in his household for 40 years? Okay, so I'm hoping that, can the panelists also see the questions in the Q&A box?
I can, yes. And so again, the question, well, it does, yeah.
Meaning, do I need to repeat each question when I discuss them, or can people see the questions that are posted in the Q&A chat box?
Yeah, for the sake of the audience, we might, we might want to just repeat the question. So, yeah, so the first question, and it definitely comes with two strong assumptions. I'll leave it to you to respond to those assumptions. But one of the audience members asks, why do Sunnis hide many hadith that say Ali was not present at the time of the first Saqifa? And why Sunnis don't admit that Muawiyah cursed Ali and his household for 40 years?
Okay, so from what I understand is that there are hadith that say that Ali was absent after the Prophet's death when leading members of the Ansar and the Muhajirun, meaning leading elders of Mecca and leading elders of Medina, came together to discuss who should succeed the Prophet. And I think what the questioner is asking is, why don't Sunnis talk about this, that Ali was absent? And, this, if you are coming from a Shi'i background, this is front and center of your views about history, that Ali was absent, he was wronged and so on. But if you read Tayyib al-Hibri's Parable in Politics, maybe I could put the answer in the chat box, so I'm typing it right here. By Tayyib al-Hibri. We see that when you read a Tabari in early Sunni historiography and later Sunni historiography, there is recognition that Ali was absent when the first caliph was elected. That this is part of accepted history. But culturally, this isn't significant for a Sunni in terms of their practice, in terms of their beliefs, it's like asking, why don't Sunnis commemorate Imam Husayn's death every year? There are some who do that, but it's not at the center of one's faith when you are a Sunni. And so the fact that Ali was absent during these, at that moment when Abu Bakr was chosen as caliph, is not at the center of Sunni thought or Sunni religion. So there isn't some sort of, I think that's the simplest way I could answer that question.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Husayn. So you might want to answer just another question. And again, I apologize to the other members who posed questions, but I think we're already over our time. And thanks, Dr. Husayn. So,
right. Well, I mean, the second part to that first question is, why is there a denial about the Umayyids cursing Ali? And I would say, we talked about this with the discussant, that when Muawiyah was rehabilitated, it became problematic. It became part of an erased history. Not only was it denied that anti-Alid was correct, it was denied that it ever existed among early Muslims. And so that denial plays a role in why polemicists today might deny the historicity of Ali being cursed. All right, so the second question is, I understand that your study is primarily a theological one, but I'm curious about this spectrum regarding Ali. Did you notice the prevalence of any of these 6 categories of opinions in one majority Sunni country compared to another, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, or whatever? I would say, these modern nation states are modern questions. And I was looking at, the medieval period, let's say right after the fall of the Abbasid Empire, when I'm thinking about all of these different spectrums that may have existed, you're going back to 100 years after the Prophet or 200 years after the Prophet. And then, well, when I'm thinking of pro-Alids, it's, 500, 600 years later. So there aren't these nation states, and I would say there's diffusion. I would say in terms of pro-Ali sentiment in its most radical form outside of Shiism, so those who may have believed Ali had all of these miraculous powers. He was a spiritual heir, even viewed him as some sort of manifestation of God. That Persian Sufism, before it turned to Safavid Shi'ism, represented that. And so yes, in Anatolia and Turkey, and then in Iran, you had people who didn't describe themselves as Shi'i, but had this Ali-centric religion at work. And it's at the end of the Abbasid Empire in Iraq and parts of Persia that you see a culture of futuwa, this youth who viewed Ali as like this patron saint. And so you had soldiers who would have Ali marked on their helmet or on their sword. You had blacksmith who viewed Ali as their cultural icon. And again, that's outside of Shi'ism. And so that's after the fall of the Abbasid Empire, near the end of it. So 500s Hijri, 600s Hijri, that you have this culture that's diffuse throughout Iraq and Persia and Turkey.
Thank you so much, Dr. Husayn. So again, I hate to stop you. I'm sorry, but so if you don't mind, again, I invite the audience members who posed the other questions to please keep in touch with Dr. Husayn, who has generously accepted to receive questions also by email. I would also like to again thank Dr. Nabi for joining us, Dr. Ahmad for joining us. I guess Dr. Hashmi had to leave, and so he apologized because of some familial commitments. Thank you so much again to all of the audience members for their patience and for their interest being with us up until now. I'll just close by saying that please feel free to join us in our next talk that is going to be on October 16th. And it's titled Social Media, Music and Poetic World Making in Iranian Publics by Dr. Nahid Siamdoust. At this point, Dr. Husayn, is there a final remark that you would like to mention before we just say goodbye to everyone?
I would like to thank all of the attendees who made the point to come here on a Saturday evening, and you're welcome to write to me. My apologies that I couldn't get to all of the questions.
Oh, no, not at all. We should apologize. Again, we're sorry. Again, thank you so much for being with us, and good night or good rest of the day to all of the attendees. Thank you so much, and bye.